that have to come up. We're just going to minimize that. All right. Well, thank you so much to everybody for being here today. We're pleased to have you, and we're pleased to talk about a subject that we probably don't give a lot of attention to, which is the idea of grief and how that fits into our lives as we have a loved one, a close friend, family member who might be affected by Alzheimer's disease or dementia. So as mentioned, my name is Jennifer Phillips. I work for the Knight Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Washington University School of Medicine. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we just call it the Knight Center, or the ADRC. And I work as a part of our center that tries to bring information and opportunities to learn more about the disease out into the community with the hopes of people, first of all, understanding more about what happens in a research setting, and also hoping that we can engage people in research as well. And it's kind of a twofold thing. You know, we don't want to just be making an ask of people without showing people and telling people this is what research is up to and doing. So we try to be very conscious of never doing, you know, too much asking without too much giving to go along. We want to keep that nice and balanced. The topic today is really interesting because I think when it comes to grief, we kind of have a picture of in our head of what that is when we might feel grief and what those kind of situations look like. But if anybody has been touched by Alzheimer's disease or another type of dementia, and a lot of times just for simplicity, I might just say Alzheimer's, but we're referring to all types of dementia in that umbrella. But it looks a little different when we think of it in the context of Alzheimer's and dementias and grief. So hopefully we can kind of talk through a little bit of that today. What I do hope is that people will feel free that if you have questions, you can ask through the program. We will leave a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So either way, we're fine with both of those. And then, you know, if there's something that especially resonates with you, you're welcome to raise your hand or make a comment or share, just because we are a small group today. And so it's nice to be able to make it a little interactive. So we do have quite a few objectives today. And what we want to do is, first of all, talk about bereavement, grief, and mourning, and how those all differ from each other. We want to discuss the when, what, and why of dementia and grief. What makes dementia different? What is the grieving process? How do we cope? And how do we support individuals who might be grieving? So first, let's start with some definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page. And the first is bereavement. So we know that bereavement is a noun and it is in itself an experience, the experience of losing someone who's close to us, important to us. It's that state of loss when someone close to an individual has died, or it's that period of grief and mourning after a death. So when you grieve, it's part of that normal part of a process of relating to a loss. And so bereavement is kind of that overall blanket that holds a lot of the other things that we'll talk about today. Bereavement includes the act of grieving, the act of mourning. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So grief itself is also a noun, and it's the anguish that's experienced after a significant loss. Usually we think about it in terms of the death of a beloved person. It's a pain. So yes, it's a noun, but it's also a very intense feeling and a negative feeling that accompanies a loss because it's a reflection of what we love, and it can feel all encompassing whenever that thing that we love goes away. And it's a strong, sometimes overwhelming emotion for people, regardless whether their sadness stems from the loss of a loved one, from a diagnosis, or something, you know, that maybe is not even affecting them individually, but is affecting a loved one. And our final part is mourning. And this is our verb. And so this is when we express our grief. When we're in mourning, we are expressing that grief. We're showing those emotions during that time following a death or following another serious loss. It's an act of sorrowing, and it's an outward expression of our grief. So it's kind of important to see how they all relate to each other, but they are a little bit different as well. But some of the things that you'll notice throughout there is that it wasn't just a loss following a death. It alluded to other losses as well. It alluded to other challenges, such as challenging diagnoses, something affecting a friend, the loss of something else significant to us. And I think that's especially significant to keep in mind when we consider dementias, because it's a very multifaceted disease and a very multifaceted process that really challenges us to think about the when, what, and why of when we're grieving. So the first thing is, when do we grieve? And so we know, first of all, when we experience a specific loss. And it doesn't have to just be someone's death or someone's transitioning, to the next chapter and whatever their spiritual world holds for them. But it could be the loss of a specific relationship or of a person. It could be future plans and dreams. And it could be the support, partnership, and companionship. And I think that's one of those things that's really hard to quantify for people, especially spouses who might have a loved one who's affected by Alzheimer's, because it's easy to think of grief and loss only when someone passes away. But the reality is, with Alzheimer's and with caregiving, we're experiencing little losses, little changes, and small subtractions each day and at each stage. And some of you may have heard before Alzheimer's being called, a death by 1,000 subtractions. And that is important to keep in mind, because it's okay and it's normal to be grieving each time one of those subtractions happen, because those losses are very profound to us. And it might be because we've lost our lifetime partner who we lean on. We might have lost the primary leader in the family. And that could be anything from, being the patriarch who everybody looks up to being the primary driver in the home or the person who pays the bills. So those changes add up in different ways. We sometimes can grieve the future plans and dreams that we had. It's especially cruel that this disease happens at our end of life, oftentimes in our later years, after we've raised our families, after we've worked our jobs, when we've retired, and we're kind of ready to live that good life. And sometimes when a chronic illness sets in, that changes our path a little bit. And people might experience grieving for the trips they weren't able to take, the retirement they didn't get to enjoy, the one-on-one time together with their partner after everyone was working so long and so hard. So it's okay to also identify things you never had that you've lost because you were anticipating them and working for them for so many years. And then again, just that support and partnership. We also do some support groups at our center. And one of our people said last month, "I can't remember the last time I felt happy," which kind of prompted us to talk a little bit more about happiness and what's wrapped up with that. But she said, "I don't have that partner that I am always used to having. And sometimes there's something funny and I want to share it. And sometimes there's just something, that I want a conversation. And that's not there anymore. That relationship has gone away." And it's okay to grieve a change in relationship. It doesn't have to be something that's tangible. We also grieve anticipation of a loss. So again, that compilation of many, many smaller subtractions, because they do add up over time. And then there's that feeling of waiting for an inevitable final loss. Unfortunately, we know that Alzheimer's disease is a fatal disease. And so until we can find that cure, until we can roll back, the progression of the disease, we do know how this ends up over time. And that weighs on people. And people do experience grief, and people do prepare for that at each stage along the way. And the thing that makes it especially challenging is the fact that this loss is ambiguous. And when it's hard to put a name on it, or when it's hard to describe it, in those cases, it's hard for other people to understand. So sometimes it's a psychological or emotional loss, not necessarily a physical loss. It can be complicated because we might feel hope, like, "Oh, there's this new medication that's been approved. This is fantastic." And then maybe your loved one is not approved to take it. Well, then you start to grieve all over again. Or why not? Why are we being left behind? It can be cumulative. So again, just when you might feel like you've gotten to the end of the tunnel of grieving on one particular issue, something fresh might come up and start to compound the process again. And it can be very hard to resolve the grief or bring someone in to help you or commiserate with you, because it's hard sometimes to quantify or even identify. And so that idea of, people might say, "Well, I don't understand why you're so upset. John is still alive. He's still with you." that doesn't mean that everything is the same as it always was. You know, a lot of times we'll hear from people, you know, the way he is today is not the person I married. And it's okay to feel that sense of loss for the person that has transitioned to another phase of their emotional being, their intellectual being, because it is something that's different for all of us. And finally, when we grieve, it's because we're experiencing a life-altering change. We're in the process of accepting a new reality and also adjusting to what our new normal and our new reality looks like. And we know with dementias and typical disease or similar diseases, those adjustments always have to be made and reformatted and made again because it is a disease that changes and continues and you know, continues to present different challenges over time. So in terms of who grieves, we know that it's not just the patient that has the diagnosis, but the care partners are undergoing a very complicated and profound grief process. And there's many times at which grief is going to feel very significant. First of all, it might be pervasive for some people throughout the entire process. It does in some ways relate to how resilient people are. You know, some people are really good at feeling things and moving on. Other people might sit with those feelings a little bit longer and maybe need more help in resolving them. And so we know that it's a process that looks different based on every individual who grieves, and that it can be a very lengthy process. People, you know, they're grieving throughout this process, as mentioned, and they're also grieving that loss of identity. You know, who am I now? I'm not, you know, the breadwinner. I am a patient. I am not the loving spouse. I'm the care partner. You know, our roles are different and our outlook and how we fulfill those roles might be different. And it's okay to grieve that change. We grieve the loss of safety and physical, emotional, or mental well-being. We take for granted on our day-to-day life when we're doing well and we're functioning and we're going about our business and doing our to-do list. But when we experience interruptions that prevent us from doing those things, we start to experience sadness and anxiety and all sorts of other emotions. And when that becomes a chronic thing, you know, that inability to achieve what you want to do, complete the tasks you normally were able to, that's when we start to notice those deficits and we start to grieve those losses over time. And finally, you know, loss of autonomy, losing the freedom to be as independent as we want to. Sometimes that's a really big one, and people can have a hard time quantifying that. For example, take driving. You know, when people have memory and thinking changes and maybe they retire from driving, it's not usually about giving up the car. It's not usually about getting rid of car keys. It's about grieving the loss of freedom and independence and ability to come and go however you want without depending on somebody else to take you. And so the thing that's being grieved in that situation is rarely the vehicle, but it's the freedom that it represents and that ability to maintain and tend to our own individual needs. And then loss of dreams or expectations. And we see this a lot with individuals who might have younger onset Alzheimer's, maybe well before the age of 65. You know, sometimes people may still have children in the home. They may still be, you know, working full time. And suddenly they have to deal with a complete upset in their day to day. You know, they might lose being able to see their retirement, being able to see their child go on to be married. And so they're starting to grieve the loss of a lot of these things that may no longer come to pass. And if you said to someone, you know, oh, I'm just so sad I can't walk my daughter down the aisle, you know, their thoughts are probably going to be like, oh, well, but look at everything you do have and you still can do. But all that really does is just say, your grief is not really important. Look at these other things. And so that's a perfect example of how people might try, even if they're trying to help, might inadvertently minimize the grief that people are feeling because they may not necessarily understand what those feelings are like. And so what does grief feel like? What do you guys think? You know, if you were to describe grief, what do you think you would say?
Sadness.
Sadness? Absolutely.
Loss.
Mm-hmm. What else? Helpless. Mm-hmm. What was that? Mm-hmm. What else? You guys, everybody over here working with the program is all quiet. You're not off the hook. Come on, come on. Doug, regret?
Sorry, empty.
Empty? Absolutely. These are all different adjectives, but they absolutely perfectly encompass what we know about grief. Sadness, we feel depression, we feel isolation. Even if you have somebody with you in the room, we might feel isolated and on our own because that person may not respond to us or interact with us in the same way, or understand what we're saying, or feel the same nuance or the emotion that you feel. Hopelessness, how can I ever do this? How can I do this as a caregiver for 8 years, 10 years, 12 years? What do I do? I'm frail. I'm also sick. I just can't even imagine how this can come together. Numbness, denial, shock, anger. Anger is a big one, and that's okay to be angry because Alzheimer's disease is really awful and it cheats people out of their senior years and their memories and their ability to do so many things. And in the long run, kind of cheats people out of the very core of who they are as people. And it's okay to be angry about that, whether it's you that has a diagnosis or your loved one. That's a perfectly valid reason, valid emotion. Fear, helplessness, worry, exhaustion, overwhelmed, and yearning. I like the idea of yearning, that, even though we are experiencing some of these losses, it's okay to still wish that things were different. Why couldn't it be, like it was? Why didn't I appreciate how mild his memory loss was last year? If I had only known it was going to be like this now. So there's all sorts of different feelings that kind of catch up to us. But there's also other feelings too that kind of make things a little bit more confusing. Gratitude. So what if we get to the point of a profoundly ill spouse or partner when they finally transition or pass away, and if we feel gratitude? How confusing is that, to feel grateful that the person you've loved, your partner, your parent, has passed away? And that's very confusing because we do know there comes a time when, maybe passing away might be the more dignified or gentle choice for someone. But to feel gratitude for it is a very frightening kind of thing to think about. Relief, again, that goes with gratitude. What about resentment? Sometimes our caregivers feel like they should be perfect all the time. They should be smiling, they should be dutiful, they should be happy, honored to do this job. And the reality is, it is a 24-hour-a-day demanding, often thankless and exhausting job, both emotionally exhausting and physically exhausting. And so it's very normal sometimes to feel resentment towards the person for whom you're giving care, especially if they are argumentative or if they can't show appreciation. Or sometimes, we assume sometimes that caregiving was because people were in a positive relationship. There are adult children out there that are caregivers for parents who might have been emotionally or physically abusive, or who may have had struggles with addiction, who may have not always cared for their child the way they might have or might wanted to have done. So then all of a sudden this adult child comes in as a full-time care partner. It might be normal to feel a little bit of resentment. And then, of course, after you feel some of those, they're likely going to lead to shame. What kind of person am I that I would be angry at my disabled mother who can't even identify herself? What does that say about me as a person? Then there's guilt that sets in right on the heels of that. And then confusion, because these are all valid emotions that can exist in the same place. You don't just have to pick one. They actually all commingle together. And then eventually, we hope to get to a place of healing. We hope to be able to validate all these feelings as completely normal and healthy in the grieving process, to the point where we can eventually reach healing and see what that looks like moving forward for us. And I like this particular thought. I saw this online in multiple places, so I don't think it's copyright or trademarked to anybody in particular, but it says the therapeutic purpose of grief. So why we feel grief and why we mourn is to get you to the place where you can live with the loss in a healthy way. And I liked that. It's not a finite situation. It's not an end point in and of itself. It is the process you go through to get to the other side to live with that loss in a healthy way. And I liked that, to think about it as a trajectory and to think about these being the feelings and the emotions and experiences it takes you to come out the other side. And then again, there's no single or correct way to grieve, and that's okay. Some people grieve with humor. Some people, grieve with gallows humor. Some people, don't talk about it at all. Some people talk about it too much. And there's no right or wrong way to do that. And so why do we grieve? And I think that's one of the interesting things to think about is, why do we grieve? Think about how long we've been humans. How many years have we existed as a society? But when it comes to death and loss, we've not gotten any better at it, which is kind of interesting to think about. We still don't talk about it very openly. We still don't grieve collectively. We have a lot of conflicting feelings as it relates to death. And you'd think we'd really kind of have it down by now. Unfortunately, we don't. So why? Why do we grieve? And the first is evolutionarily. Humans are hardwired to form bonds as a result of needing to survive. If you were a lone wolf out there in the wild, then you were more likely to experience hardship or to be killed by, enemies or invaders than people who were together in a group. So evolutionarily, our safety was predicated on forming bonds. So we've grown as a society used to forming those connections and depending on those connections, not just emotionally, but again, for our very survival. Physiologically, we know that forming those relationships in our brain leads to the release of chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, all those feel-good chemicals that we like. And whenever the object of those feel-good chemicals is lost to us, we want them back. We want that person back. We want that feel-good back. And so physically, we are hardwired to form bonds with people, and we feel that loss when they're broken, change, or go away. Emotionally, and I like some of these thoughts about why we grieve. First, we need to learn to live in our new world, in the world now, a world that is without the thing or person or experience that we are grieving. And also, grief helps us learn to be a person who carries absence. And I thought that was an interesting quote, learning to be a person who carries absence, because it's not just saying grief is a feeling, it is saying grief changes you as a person. It has taken something away from you. And now, when you're grieving and on the other side of it, you're trying to reconcile how you go out into the world being that person who's experienced that loss and carries that loss. And I think it also kind of points out that grief is a process. It's something that you might have to work at. You might have to work at identifying the emotions, figuring out what that means to you, identifying what it specifically is you're grieving, and how do you reconcile that in a way that is healthy for you to move on. And then we grieve practically. It's the idea of how do we adapt to all those tiny little things in our day-to-day life that we now have to learn to do in a new way. What do we do that now we don't cook dinner for, the family anymore? We just make dinner for ourselves. Or how do we deal with it now that, okay, we don't have a paycheck coming in? How do we sustain the family? So we also deal with grieving in terms of practically, how do we make the changes and adjustments necessary to move forward in a sustainable way? So it touches a lot of different aspects of our life. I think we think of grief as a physical, or pardon me, as an emotional thing, but truly it is encompassing every part of us as human beings. But then as we narrow our focus a little bit more, dementia and grief is different. And what makes it different? So the first thing is the losses are gradual and they're plentiful. What we know about Alzheimer's disease is, first of all, people typically start showing changes in their memory and thinking about 3 years before they're even diagnosed with the disease. So that's a lot of confusion and change to be dealing with without having a concrete word or name for it. And then somebody might get that diagnosis and be like, I'm so embarrassed at how angry I was. All I could complain about was he couldn't, drive safely anymore. And now I realize he's experiencing this. Or she has been leaving messes all over the house and I've just been yelling, yelling, yelling. And now I realize she couldn't do anything about it. So 3 years up to the point of diagnosis. And then we know that the disease can often go on for an average of 8 to 10 years after diagnosis. Some shorter, some longer, but that's a long time to be experiencing small changes and subtractions and losses. And that adds up in terms of our psyche and our emotions. We know that the disease has a long trajectory, but it also has an uneven path. Sometimes it very much feels like, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes you might hear, oh, they had a really good day today. And that gives you hope, that gives you joy. You see glimpses of that person you love, you were committed to. And then the next day, things are back to maybe that uncomfortable degree of change that you've experienced before. And that's hard, it's confusing. It makes it difficult to grieve because just when you get to that point where you might have some acceptance, all of a sudden you just get kicked back to square one and have to start that process again. Dementia is, the care is not just emotionally taxing, but it's also physically and mentally taxing as well. Often this affects a lot of our older adults who may not be in their peak physical form. So it's kind of hard to deal with that as an older adult who might be experiencing their own illnesses or frailties. And then you add the emotional load, the mental load to it, and it's very overwhelming. And that opens the door to all those conflicting emotions we saw earlier. That's when we feel all those fear and anger and shame and guilt and loss, all spiraling up into one package. There's also that confusion of living and grieving with a person who's still with you, but is no longer the same person. People don't see the losses that you're experiencing, and that's really hard. They might not see them or they might not understand them. And that might be, for example, the adult child that comes home over Thanksgiving and says, Mom, I don't know why you are always being so dramatic about this. Dad is fine. Well, they're seeing a very small snapshot in time of a larger situation. People might not necessarily see the subtleties. We hear sometimes caregivers will say, he's so great when we go out in public, but when we're at home, it's so hard, these behaviors. And so not only can they not understand them, but they might not even see them at all. So not only is that something people aren't privy to, but if you talk about it, people are going to be like, what is she talking about? It makes people almost deny your experience, which is challenging. Nobody wants to be, talking and asking for help or seeking support only to be, rejected or said that your feelings aren't valid. That's definitely no way to live. And then the disease being a protracted process, again, leads to a long process of grief, and it's exhausting. Grieving is an exhausting process. So in the middle of everything else that someone's dealing with, that emotional load is just out there, and it's very challenging. So some things that are common in the grieving process, and these are actually taken from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 Stages of Grief, which we've all heard, denial, acceptance, all those. But here's some interesting trivia I didn't realize until I was researching for this program, is that those stages of grief are actually intended for the patient, the person with the diagnosis, in terms of how they process through the diagnosis and getting to the ultimate end where they have acceptance and they can move on. So this looks a little bit different for us as we're going to look at it in terms of being a care partner, and then also in terms of how it looks with respect to dementia. So first, of course, we have denial, that hoping the person's not ill. We might see these early denial stages, for example, in that first 3 years when somebody isn't going and getting that diagnosis. We might see it in that getting multiple second opinions during that process when somebody doesn't want to admit what it is they're dealing with. Procrastinating on medical care or going out and getting that diagnosis, expecting the person to get better. Oh, they were only out of sorts on vacation because it was a whole different location for us. Everything's fine. So people are always trying to put that bright spin on things, and it might be pushing down potential red flags. Convincing yourself that the person has not changed. This can be really powerful for children. Oh, dad's the same, dad's fine, you're just overreacting. Now that he's retired and you're home together, you're seeing things. And so it's oftentimes minimized by people who just don't see it. Attempting to normalize problematic behaviors. Oh, well, he gets up and wanders in the middle of the night because he's older and his prostate's changed and he has to go to the bathroom. People find ways to normalize behaviors that are potentially challenging. and then not telling others about the symptoms or the diagnosis. And we're very lucky that as a society, we've learned so much about Alzheimer's disease and about dementias. And we know that this is not caused by something people did. It's not caused by poor choices. It is a disease that happens to people like some diseases do and some don't. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's just a random luck of the draw. That's why it's called sporadic onset Alzheimer's disease. So not telling other people, we know that now about the disease, that it is sporadic. It's nothing that should be guilt inducing. It shouldn't be embarrassing. So we're talking about it more. We're learning, we're educating ourselves, and we're finding supports. So we're seeing that stigma start to drop away from it, which is wonderful. I mean, cancer used to have a stigma where doctors wouldn't even tell the patients that you have cancer. They would, hush, hush out in the hallway with the family. We're getting to a more dignified and empowering place when it comes to dementias, but people sometimes still might feel that shame or that fear, and they might not tell other people about the diagnosis. And that's common in the grieving process. We kind of consider the idea of disclosure, like when do you decide to tell your family, your friends, your employer, as one of the big early obstacles that people want to plan for and decide very deliberately how they move forward with that particular effort. Anger. We know that anger is felt very strongly on both sides of the care partner and patient dyad. So first, being frustrated with the person, repetition, we hear a lot as one of those first early things, and people just want to rip their hair out after hearing the same story for the 7th time, or being asked, what are we doing today? Yet again, I've already told you, we're going to the doctor, then we're going to lunch. No, you didn't. That leads to a lot of frustration and anger. Resentment, feeling resentful about the demands of caregiving. This is the time when people might say, oh gosh, I wanted to get divorced 10 years ago. I made it work, and now look where we are. If I had run away with Jane when she asked me to, I wouldn't be in this position right now. People resent the demands. They look back at all of the crossroads they've come to and wonder, what if I did something differently? Resenting family members who cannot or will not provide care. And we hear this a lot. I don't understand why, like, especially in blended families, I don't understand why his kids don't come and help out, things like that. Nobody sees the constant effort that goes into caregiving, and nobody can accurately understand the load that's going in, and they might not know that the help is needed. Feeling cheated out of your future, which is very common, and feeling abandoned, that nobody is there for you or nobody understands the processes that you're going through. Eventually that transitions into guilt, which is very, very, we talked about it a little bit, but it's a very powerful emotion, because not only, anger we can deal with. Sometimes it's easier to be angry than it is to feel sad or vulnerable or scared. But guilt is different, because guilt challenges us to take a hard look at ourselves and the decisions we've made, and if we could have done better. And so, for example, guilt about having unrealistic expectations. What if I did this better? What if we were diagnosed earlier? What if we had, not lived in this area with certain pollutions? People will think of anything when they're looking for ways out or ways to justify why this happened. Feeling bad because you're still able to enjoy your quality of life. I hate that I can still go out and spend time with my friends because my spouse can't. Feeling bad that you failed, for example, if you put the person in a care community. This is a huge one. There's a lot of people that feel that their caregiving ability is synonymous with who they are as a person. I'm a good caregiver, I'm a good person. I'm a bad caregiver, that makes me a bad person. And that's not a fair equivalency to make. None of us are trained to do this. None of us went to nursing school or psychiatry programs. We're not trained to do this. And so being willing to ask for help and support, looking at care communities are, sometimes we feel guilty, but we fail to recognize that sometimes it's a very dignified choice for people. Sometimes they might receive better care in one of those scenarios. And sometimes we have to think about care, not just for our loved one, but for ourselves as well. And it shouldn't be something that breeds guilt, but unfortunately it does. Having negative thoughts about the person, wishing that he or she would go away or die. Again, what is very apparent to us when it comes to Alzheimer's disease is sometimes there are things that can be worse than death. And when you might not recognize your loved ones, when they're no longer the person they were, when they can't remember, when they can't function for themselves, that brings up these challenging feelings about life or death, quality of life, and guilt is right smack dab in the middle of it. And then finally, regretting things about your relationship before the diagnosis. What if I had, I'm so mad that I did this or that, and now he'll never truly understand how badly I feel about that. Things that maybe you always wanted to say that went left unsaid. So it can be very challenging to progress in your relationship, knowing there were imperfections or things you had done differently when that time has passed. So some other things moving on through this disease process: sadness, again, feeling overwhelmed by loss, tears, crying frequently, potentially withdrawing from social activities, or the converse, needing to engage with people more often because you're not getting what you need in your home or in your caregiving situation. And then maybe withholding your emotions or displaying them more openly than usual. And if you'll notice, some of these are exact opposites of each other. So it's like maybe you're doing this or not doing it at all. It's because, again, we can't set one size fits all when it comes to grieving. Everybody is going to feel their own emotions. And there's probably things on these lists, there's things that people haven't even identified yet that they're feeling. And so it's okay to feel however way you want to, if it takes you towards learning to live with the loss. And then finally, we move closer towards acceptance. And acceptance is that idea of what do we do in healthy ways to move forward. So learning to live in the moment, not casting blame or anger or regrets about things that have happened in the past, but capitalizing on the time and the experiences you're having now. Finding personal meaning as a caregiver. What does that mean to you as a person who's giving care to someone who's terminally ill? If you are providing care for your terminally ill parent who maybe was not a very good parent, what does that say about you as someone who provides forgiveness and provides love and is the bigger person? That's something to feel pride in instead of, any of these other challenging feelings. Understand how the grieving process affects your life, having perspective that, it can affect your sleep, your relationships, your work performance, your physical health, your emotional well-being, your ability to concentrate. All of those things can be affected, and understanding that and, being able to say, I'm sorry, this has just been consuming me. I haven't been paying attention, appreciating personal growth that comes from surviving loss. Everybody will come out the other side of this. And ideally, people will come out the other side stronger and, able to honor the loss that they've experienced, but recognize everything they put into seeing it through and coming out the other side. And then sense of humor, which I think is great. We tell people in our support groups, if you don't laugh in your support groups, you need to find a new one. Just because when something is not at its best, you have to do what you can to get through. And sometimes it is just laughing at the sheer absurdity of it all. And then finally, being able to ask for help and accept help from other people. And that's one of the hardest things. People really, really feel shame in asking for help from other people because as a society, we are so conditioned to be able to do everything ourselves. And asking for help is seen as a sign of weakness. And that's just kind of ridiculous because it takes so much to be able to ask for help that we shouldn't be, thought of in any negative way for it. We should be, helped and thought of, it's wonderful that she had the foresight to ask for support. And then finally, coping, to talk a little bit about how do we cope when we're dealing with grief. The first is face the feelings. Don't push them down. Don't compartmentalize them. Don't deny them. It's okay to take time for your mental health, address what you're feeling, and it's okay to be sad about it. If your trip was canceled because your, plane had a malfunction, you would grieve and you would be upset for it. And it's okay to be upset for the trip that's not happening because you can't plan it because somebody has dementia. It's the same loss, it's loss of a trip, but one's planned, one's not. It's okay to face, to feel a certain way about those different things. Prepare it to experience these feelings of loss more than once. Claim the grieving process as your own. You don't owe anybody any expectations about what makes you cry or when you do or don't go somewhere or what triggers you or what makes you feel better. You do what you need to do to get to that emotional place where you can move on in your life. Definitely try to combat those feelings of isolation and loneliness because having that support system is going to be beneficial in the long run, assuming you have supportive friends and family members, of course. Know that some people may not understand your grief. I don't think, for example, children, younger folks might understand. They don't have the experience of living with a beloved partner for 40, 50 years and seeing that person start to change and experience a terminal illness. They might not necessarily have that same perspective about the losses that are happening. So just know going into it, some people might not understand. Accept yourself, and that includes all your strengths and all of your weaknesses, because we all have them. There's no such thing as a perfect caregiver. We all are doing the best we can with what information we have at any given time. And so accept that sometimes you'll do it right and sometimes you might not. And then finally, take care of yourself. One of the things that we do know when it comes to caregivers and the person for whom they're giving care is that care partners are more likely to experience catastrophic illness and death as compared to the person they're caregiving for. It's that demanding, it's that taxing on individuals' health. And so it's important that caregivers, even if they might not be inclined to do it, it's important that caregivers put themselves first. Because the short version of it is, if mom is not happy, nobody's happy. But that's truly the truth of caregiving. If you're not healthy, if you're not taking care of yourself, if your needs are not met as a caregiver, you can't meet the needs of the person for whom you're giving care. So try sometimes to recognize the small positives throughout this journey. First, even though it's a very devastating diagnosis, having that, it gives people time to plan and set the direction for how they would like to end their life. And that can be a very healing part of the journey for people to make those plans together. Do the bucket list items that are possible, and it might even be an activity where people sit down together at the helm of getting this diagnosis and say, what have you always wanted to do? And it doesn't mean it might be, climbing Mount, whatever. It might be taking a trip somewhere, or it might be apologizing to somebody who you had a fractured relationship with. It might be, trying to learn the guitar when you never were able to. There's little things, both tangible and intangible, that might go onto a bucket list. Say those things that need to be said. You don't want to be on the other side of a changed relationship or of a loss, thinking, why didn't I ever tell him how much I loved him? Why didn't he know how proud I was of him? Why didn't, she never knew how much I looked up to her. So find the time to make sure those little things are never left unsaid. Right long-standing wrongs. And I think that's a powerful one too. Don't let regrets be the last thing you have left of your loved one after they've, ultimately passed away. Reconcile complex relationships, and above all, celebrate the life that was lived. It's an interesting idea, but it's kind of neat to honor the person as they transition through this disease and recognize all the wonderful things about them before they get to that point where a lot of those things are lost. So one of the last things we're going to talk about is how to help a grieving caregiver. And the first thing is listen. Don't assume that don't just kind of assume everything's fine. It's okay to listen, to ask questions. How are things doing? And what are they going to say? Fine. Yep, exactly. Things are fine. Probe a little. What do you mean? I mean, how are you feeling emotionally? How's your peace of mind? How is your relationship together? Do you feel like you two are connecting emotionally, not just as a caregiver and a partner? It's okay, especially if you know the person well, to probe a little bit to create that safe space where they can open up and share. I like this one especially, share memories. The thing about Alzheimer's is sometimes it's a very isolating disease because people don't know what to say. They might be hesitant to be around a loved one. They might be nervous about getting together because they're like, well, what do I say? What do I do? I don't want to make him feel bad. I don't want to be uncomfortable. It's okay to say, I remember this time we did that. Or what about that? Or he was so funny this time that happened. Share those memories and honor who the person was, because that's like, gold to a care partner, that someone out there sees them, sees their loved one, and wants to share those fond memories. Don't pretend to have the answers, because I've been working in this field for 20 years and I definitely don't have the answers. I mean, it is amazing how many times I hear concerns from people, and it's like the first time I've ever heard that concern this far into my career. So you can't pretend to have all the answers, because there just isn't. There's never going to be an end to the complications and the things that pop up. Acknowledge the depth of their losses. Don't minimize them. It's so frustrating when people will say, oh, well, everything happens for a reason, or at least you had 45 good years together. I mean, would any of that make you feel better? No, but we just feel like we have to say something, we have to say something. And it's okay to say, I really don't know what to say right now, but I am here, or can I give you a hug? Or I am always a phone call away at any time of the day. You don't even have to say anything. You can just call me, and it's okay for anything. Remember, grief isn't linear. You might see somebody struggling and then they are happy the next time, and then they're struggling again. And you might think, what's the deal with that? They were fine last week. It doesn't work like that. It is truly an up and down, peaks and valleys kind of situation. Don't advocate for closure. I think people kind of think that, maybe when somebody passes away or whatever, now that book is closed and we move on. And we don't want that. We don't want to close the book. We don't want to put it on the shelf. We don't want to forget about it. What we want is acceptance of this loss. How do we integrate it into the life that we live? And how do we move forward knowing that things are changed, but that person is still a part of their life, even though they may have passed away, or even though they are profoundly affected by memory loss and confusion. I also wanted to put up here some resources and support, because there truly are some amazing places that people can go to tap into emotional support and also knowledge when it comes to caregiving and grief. Employee assistance programs are wonderful if you happen to have one, and if you're still employed and have one. Support groups. I really liked a lot of the material I found from the Canadian Virtual Hospice. They have incredible trainings. They have sessions that can take you through an entire educational trajectory. Really, really fantastic resources. The Alzheimer's Association is an incredible resource when it comes to everything related to dementia. Jeremy will tell you a little bit more about some of those services, but one thing I always like to say when it comes to the Alzheimer's Association website is it's almost too good. So it's easy to go there and be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So just take little bites. You might want to learn something at one point, go in and take a little chunk, come back another time and grab another little chunk. So that way we would hate for anybody to get overwhelmed by too much information and not go back, instead of just going and picking here and there. Our House Grief Support Center, hospice organizations are fantastic. One thing that I've learned is that for individuals who may have a loved one on hospice care, that those hospice organizations also provide up to 1 year of grief support for care partners after their loved one passes away. So tie into those resources from hospice, because they're there for you and they're there to help ease that transition for you. Not to forget that children are also profoundly affected by grieving, and they don't have as much frame of reference as older adults do. And so they might not understand what it's like to experience loss. They may have never lost someone close to them before. So there's resources there for children's grief as well. There's online support, there's books, there's anything you really want. It's just a matter of what format is most comfortable to you. So definitely check that out. And then I also put on there the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, just because we know that when people lose their partner, especially from a disease that can be as traumatic as a dementia, that sometimes those types of feelings or suicidal ideation might be something they experience. And we want to make sure people are connected with the help and support if that is something that they are thinking about. There are also a couple group books that were recommended to us. I originally put Creating Moments of Joy by Jolene Brackey on there, and it was actually some people who heard this program for the very first time that suggested the following two. So Ambiguous Loss by Pauline Boss. It's kind of easy to remember, rhymes a little bit, but there's the link if you happen to want to jot that down. And then When Reasoning No Longer Works, a practical guide for caregivers dealing with dementia and Alzheimer care. So that came very highly lauded as well. And then I'll let you finish jotting those down before I move forward. Right, got those. All right. Oop, I still see a pen moving, so I don't want to move too quickly. All right. And then finally, I like this here. It says, I have to move myself off there because I have a little visual of myself there. But grief is your way of trying to keep the person who had died in your life while trying to build a new life without them. And again, if you did not get the hint, because I've said it about 7 times, but truly there's no right or wrong way to grieve. The only way to do it wrong is by not letting people connect with you, by not seeking services, not seeking support, and trying to go about it on your own. So that's what I have to share. I know Jeremy wants to share some information with you about some services and supports offered by the Alzheimer's Association. And then when he's done with that, how about we open up the floor for some questions and we can share if anybody's so inclined to do so. Okay, all right. Close this. Jeremy, do you have slides? Okay, well, let me take this off here. Maybe. Okay, I will let you come up here behind the podium. Yes, you have to be seen and be seen.
So I can be seen.
That's right.
One thing Jennifer is right about is our website is large, right? She was a very kind descriptor of that. So what I'm going to do today is break a few things down. But first, let's take a step back. She's not wrong in any of these things. So like a lot of what she's talking about, I don't pretend I'm an expert, but we're in our 4th go around of this. And so a lot of the things that she's talking about, I'm seeing in the dynamics between my mother and father-in-law right now, where conversations are no longer happening. You ask a question, you get an answer, and that's it. And it's a very lonely way about this. And it's difficult, right? So what I want to talk about today briefly are maybe 3 to 4 things that could be of benefit to you. And so what I thought I would do, I'm not going to go through this entire awareness program, but there's a couple slides on there that I've got more than enough here if you want to grab it. And I have kind of a 1-step, 2-step, 3-step in terms of support groups along the way. So let's talk first. You want to hand those out? Okay. So let's talk first about our 24/7 helpline, which I describe as our first line of defense. And really, if we take nothing away from my few moments up here today, that's your entry portal to just about everything we do. You don't need to write it down. It's on these documents multiple times. But just to get an understanding of how you might utilize the helpline, if you have a question about Alzheimer's and dementia, you can call that line. If you wake up at 2:30 in the morning and you have a burning desire to talk about how do I get a power of attorney, you can call that line. If it's 4 o'clock in the morning and the person that you care for having a rough night, maybe they're trying to get out of the house, maybe they think it's time to go to work and it's not, and you're trying to figure out what's going on because they've been retired for 15 years, you can call that line and get tactics on how you can help your person lose that anxiety, become calm, however you want to describe that right there. And you can also call to vent. If you don't feel connected, if you feel alone, you can call that number and we'll listen, right? So that's kind of the first thing along the way. The second, and one of the pathways to this would be through the alz.org website. But one of our jobs, and Jennifer helps out with this as well, is we put on what's called community education at places like libraries and fitness centers and senior centers. And so we have a very large library of caregiving topics. How do you handle and mitigate behaviors? How do you play that Scooby-Doo role to understand what's causing John to do what John does? And how do I help John along the way. Could be communication tactics. It could be, how do you have tough conversations around driving or doctor's visits or legal and financial. I call those the taboo topics. All those are available on our website. You can watch recordings, or in this flyer, there's also a resource called communityresourcefinder.org. And that's important because it's almost like a search engine for all things dementia related. So if you wanted to find an education and say, okay, I live here, I'm trying to find something 25 miles around me, plug in your zip code, and up will come the things that are available from a support group perspective or a education perspective. If you're looking for hospice, if you're looking for an elder care attorney, if you're looking for transportation, it's not all encompassing, but it can give you a really good start. The other aspect, and I know Jennifer does several down at the night ADRC, but our support groups. And so those are scattered throughout the state as well. One of the flyers that I'm definitely going to give you as well is what we call our 1, 2, 3 step process. Believe it or not, you start by calling the helpline and you say, I live in Baldwin, Missouri, and I'm looking for a caregiver support group. And they start to flush out. They'll do the work for you along those ways. I think the last thing, and this is super important as well. Real quick, is everybody Missouri? Do we have any Illinois folks in here today? One Illinois? Okay. Go ahead.
But I'm caring for sister.
Mhm.
Has a little bit of an issue. She's in Missouri.
Okay,
So
all right.
it's not just Missouri.
So, okay, thank you for that. So the one thing too, this again, how do you get there? Helpline, right? Missouri has a funded program called the Missouri Caregiver, I think, Relief Program is what it is. So every year, and it's not going just yet, it will fall over, but you can call to get on a wait list to see if you are eligible. But it's up to $1,000 in respite reimbursement per calendar year. Now, these are county specific. And so why I would encourage you to call is because there's only a certain amount allotted for St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Jefferson County, Cape Girardeau County, et cetera. So it's not necessarily life-changing dollars, but it's $1,000. And so it can be used for respite reimbursement, some nutrition products, some incontinence products, safety products, things like that. So if you're not aware, and I keep coming back to, everything comes from that helpline number. So if you're looking for a support group, and I'll make sure I share these documents here before we get out of here today, because that communityresourcefinder.org, there's a slide on there, peruse through it. I can't encourage you enough. The helpline, again, it's there, right? And most people wait way too long to call this number before they start to utilize that. Yes, ma'am?
Jeremy, this is all free too. We want to reiterate.
It costs you nothing. There's nothing that we do that costs you. No, it's your time, right? It's your time. She's not wrong with the support groups. So I always tell the story because it makes me happy. I go hang out there every now and then, but we have an all men's group at Chesterfield Valley. So to help you understand, there's a little bit of crying, there's a little bit of cussing, there's some dirty jokes, and everybody gets together because it's their group, right? Find your group, find your people. And I think what you're going to find is that if you are newer to the journey, there's going to be someone else that's a little further down the way, and maybe someone that's towards the end of that journey with their spouse, but they're coming back for a reason, and it's to help people along the way. So if you can find your group, I think you will find it to be an invaluable resource, maybe more so than the education and some of the other things that you find, because like she just said a moment ago, I don't always know what to say, but I can be here for you. And that's a big part of it. Trying to remember if there's anything else that I'm missing. The biggest thing, helpline support, respite program. I would throw education on there again, simply because I find the more that you know about this disease in all aspects of it, the easier may not be the word, but the less scary it becomes. Knowledge is power, and you know how to make life better for your person. You might know how to handle things different. Still going to be frustrating. Okay. We make no promise that anything that we do is going to make that first tactic is going to work like a charm, but we do promise that if you will learn and continue to work these processes, just like doing a bicep curl, you're going to get stronger in this as well. So those are the main things that I wanted to hit today. I'll take a few moments and answer any questions, or I can turn it right back over to Jennifer here. Okay, I'm going to leave these documents up here and you feel free to grab them. I think they could be very, very helpful.
Does anyone have any questions for Jennifer or Doug or